Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm Jennifer McRorie, the Director Curator here at the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery, and I'm pleased to have you all join us this evening for a dialogue with Marsha Kennedy to talk about her retrospective exhibition Embodied Ecologies, which is currently on display at the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery is located on Treaty 4 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I also want to acknowledge our funders for their support. They are the Government of Canada, the Department of Canadian Heritage, Sask Arts, Canada Council for the Arts, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, and the City of Moose Jaw. Although we're approaching this discussion as an interview, as I invite you all to feel free to participate in the discussion and add comments or questions throughout as we go along. So as I said, please feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a question or want to make a comment. You're also welcome to type in any questions or comments in the chat room, but we would love to hear your voice, so please feel free to unmute yourself. First, I'll start by introducing Marcia and the exhibition. So the retrospective exhibition Embodied Ecology celebrates the compelling, poetic, political, and hauntingly beautiful work of Marsha Kennedy. Drawn from 25 public and private collections throughout Western Canada, the exhibition explores the conceptual basis and evolution of Marsha's practice throughout multiple bodies of work that engage in concepts pertaining to the body, motherhood, feminism, spirituality, nature, museology, ecology, environmental sustainability, and colonial impacts on the land, spanning the course of Marsha's impressive and prolific 4-decade career. This survey brings together over 120 works in printmaking, painting, mixed media, installation, and sculpture to present a richly layered picture of the diversity and yet unifying conceptual threads in her practice. Born in 1951, Marsha Kennedy lived her first few years in Rollo, Saskatchewan before her family moved to Regina, where she was raised and has subsequently spent most of her life. She began her art training at the University of Regina, working in printmaking under Jacques Cowan and completing a Bachelor of Fine Arts in 1977. She moved to Toronto, where she received her MFA from York University, where she worked under Eugenio Tellez, who was instrumental in moving her interests in her work towards sociopolitical issues. Early in life, Marcia understood that her relationship with nature and other species was fundamental to the quality of her life. This recognition became the motivational force behind her art practice. During her 11 years in Toronto, her interests were deepened through her volunteer work with the Toronto Humane Society's newly launched wildlife rehabilitation program, her work with Pollution Probe, and involvement in a women's neighborhood environmental advocacy group. She returned to Regina with her son, teaching fine arts at the University of Regina for 25 years until she retired in 2016. Her work focuses predominantly on issues specific to Saskatchewan, but holds relevancy throughout the world. She often uses regional species to relay concerns and awareness relating to ecosystem loss and degradation, species loss, animal rights, and the losses incurred by Indigenous and Métis peoples. Her artistic approach hovers between the didactic and the poetic, the material and the metaphysical. Motivated beyond personal sentiment, she encourages her audience to recognize the essential meaning of our relationship to nature and other species. She's compelled to awaken and provoke a change that challenges our current cultural values, beliefs, habits, and lifestyle. Most recently, her work has turned to a more personal reflection of the many changes she has witnessed and resonates with the despair over experienced and anticipated ecological and species loss. Marsha's exhibited her work across Canada, has been the recipient of numerous arts awards, both provincially and nationally. She's in the collection of Sask Arts, the University of Saskatchewan, the University of Guelph, the City of Regina, the Mackenzie Art Gallery, the Vernon Public Art Gallery, the Cherniac Art Gallery in Assiniboia, the Esplanade Arts and Heritage Center in Medicine Hat, and the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery. Marcia has been very actively teaching and mentoring young artists for more than 30 years. She's curated group exhibitions for public and commercial galleries as a way to bring artists together or to bring public attention to artists whose work she admires. So now to start, Marcia, I was wondering if you could talk about your early experiences in your undergraduate program at the U of R, where you were working in printmaking. You mentioned that you'd initially intended to work in painting, but you switched your discipline, and so I was wondering if you could talk about what those early years were like and what influenced you to go into printmaking.
Okay. Well, yes, you're right. I was more interested in painting when I started in the program, but at that time, and that was in the 70s, there was a very strong attitude that representational work wasn't important. It was, and I did learn a lot of things during that time, but it really emphasized large abstraction, color field painting, abstract expressionism, and pop art too was still quite popular at that point too. And I tried to work with it within those areas, but it just wasn't me. I did learn, and I don't regret being a student at that time because I did really learn very much about the formal aspects of working on a two-dimensional surface, and it did really sensitize me to things that might have taken longer for me to see or understand had I not gone through that. But to be able to really get into ideas and things that interested me personally, I found that printmaking was more open, and printmaking had been at that time going through a real, it was a very expanded internationally, and there was a lot of printmaking activity, and I think that pop art had a lot to do with that. But there was also a lot happening in Europe. It was just a medium that was new and interesting. And so that's where I found my place. And that's when I was able to start exploring other things that interested me, that were using, representational imagery.
Okay. You started delving into feminist work during your BFA. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the work you were doing then, some of the subject matter you were working with, and maybe how it evolved after your BFA.
Okay. I'm thinking back, when I was in undergraduate, I don't know when this work began, but it started to become very personal and self-reflective. But rather than using me or the image of myself, I used dolls. And it was a way of representing myself, and I guess women too. It wasn't very. I mean, I knew that there was feminism, but it was very quiet back then. And but in those earlier days, when I began that work, not long after that, there was a surge in feminist awareness, and art and feminism started to surface. But for me back then, it was more of a way of exploring my own kind of feelings, uncertainties, frustrations, and concerns. And they weren't always clear ideas. They were notions, feelings, kind of gut feeling things that I explored those issues. And from there, I did graduate with my BFA with that body of work. And it was after that I started exploring other issues that were still based on my interests as a woman. But I started looking out a little bit more on what was happening. I used high heels a lot as a symbol of social femininity, and for me as well, a kind of restriction that was imposed on me.
When you began your MFA program at York University, you were also, you continued to work with some of that imagery, as far as I understand, and then that evolved to you started working under Eugenio Tellez, and I was wondering how he influenced you in your work, and maybe what were you exposed to and influenced during your MFA? I remember you mentioning Marxism at one point too.
Yeah, my studio work started out with still feminist issues, but what I started to feel, and then there was that rise too that was starting to grow throughout Toronto, and it was exciting, but for me as an artist and exploring those ideas, there was also a lot of anger in the imagery. And I asked myself, well, do I want to be there with my imagery? Do I want to be in that place of anger? Because not that politically the ideas felt right, but I wanted a relationship with my art that didn't have that kind of anger in it. Where am I going with this? Okay, with Marxism, that kind of is separate from where I was in my work in graduate school, because I moved out of women's imagery and those issues and started to go kind of, I would say, underground a bit, more back, self-reflecting, feeling my way with, you know, different ideas, exploring things more from a gut level and observing things around me. So my work didn't reflect that at that time. Yes, I was interested in, through Eugenio Tellez, I became more interested and aware of, you know, political issues, social issues internationally. And I did get involved with a small group of students, some of them international students studying Marxism, etc., which I found really interesting. It was a part of understanding and learning, and one of the phases in my life that a lot of that information I took forward with me. I didn't stay in that community, but it was important. It was an important part of my learning.
And when you were in graduate school, you were working in printmaking, but then you kind of broke out into experimenting, isn't that right? With other, incorporating sort of installation, light boxes, that sort of thing?
Oh, right.
Or was that after grad school?
Yeah, no, I forgot about the light boxes and stuff. Yeah, and those were definitely connected to, you know, feminist issues. So again, I would say that my MFA years were a real mixture of things going on, because I had left my home city for the first time and I was exposed to a lot. So yes, I did play with, you know, installation a bit and other materials, light boxes and stuff, even though I remained within the printmaking discipline. I was exploring other things as well.
The earliest work in the exhibition, Embodied Ecologies, is Quapalan Time, which is a piece from 1981 and was created during your MFA years. now it's been suggested, it's been written about your work that that piece, that it was one of your first works that explored a personal relationship with nature. Can you talk a little bit about the that work?
That work came out of an experience I had, because when I was in Toronto, I was still returning home to teach at the Fort Sands Summer School of the Arts in the summer. And that particular piece came from an experience of going out at night, you know, from our residencies. And it was probably in August, because we were, I don't remember who I was with, but I remember laying back on the very top of a hill, watching the meteor showers. And there was a moment that night where, you know, just laying there, everyone's quiet. I actually don't even really, my memories don't actually include people, but I know I wouldn't have been brave enough to go by myself. But just being up there looking, laying down, looking up into the stars and skies and meteors. And there was a moment where I felt like I was falling into the sky, which wasn't a very pleasant experience. It was like, you know, you just want to, you know, grab the grass or whatever. It was an unpleasant feeling that I had a kind of quick reflex of a discomfort, but it was a feeling that made me think about that experience. And I guess when I went back to Toronto, I started working or thinking about those ideas and putting a piece together. But I do think a lot of the time that I was in Toronto, I was working on experiences, real experiences that I had on the prairies, because most of my life was on the prairies. And those experiences were still feeding me creatively.
Great. That piece too, Quapalentine, you've got pieces of carbon that are inset within the shadow box. So is that one of the earliest pieces where you're sort of where you're connecting or referencing sort of interconnectedness of all things, you know, carbon being an element that, you know, is common to bodies, earth and stars. Yes. Was that sort of your first statement?
Yes, it was, I guess too, and many people can have very moving experiences laid on top of a hill looking up into the night stars and the night skies. So I'm not the only one, but yeah, it was the realization of being connected. Also a feeling of losing boundaries or control. And that can feel frightening. So it was, you know, thinking about that experience, probably reading things, just absorbing that experience and reflecting on it. So yes, the coal was purposely set in there because the coal found on the earth is the leftovers from life from eons ago, but that connection of carbon also to the elements that are out in the universe and the stars as well. And there was another little thing added into that print that I purposely made into the shape of a fortune cookie and pinned it down onto the inside of the frame. And the words say, the uninterrupted process of coming into being and passing away, of kind of thinking about that unfolding, the continual unfolding of life that has occurred from the very moment that some kind of very ancient primitive life form occurred on Earth to the very moment that I am right now. And so it was kind of thinking about those connections that I was working with that work. And I think a lot of those ideas started maybe becoming more, I became more conscious of those kinds of ideas and that way of thinking, that I think actually began or started me on this pathway to my work as an artist and the rest of my, life practice. Yeah, you maybe, if you can, yeah, there's the Qu'Appelle in time. And Qu'Appelle, because I was in the Qu'Appelle Valley. And in time is that in time, all time, circular time, cycles of time. And here's me, this is an image that I took of myself from a Xerox machine. And the last image on that, which actually is blocked off from our images, is a xerography of my ear. Of course, it's not the actual xerograph. Can I say that? No. Photocopy. It is then transferred onto film and made into a photo etching. So in this print, there's photo etching, there's several plates, and also there's lithography in this too. So it's several processes.
When did you start working in painting? What inspired that shift from printmaking?
So when I graduated from York University, I was aware that of Open Studio, which is a printmaking studio that you can become a member of and use the facilities for a fee in Toronto. But there was a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, working in a community like that where equipment is complex and has to be perfectly clean made me sometimes grumpy. And yet there could be nice things about that. But I also felt restrained by the process of printmaking itself. I do like working in a more private environment. In fact, I really like working in a domestic environment, which one could do possibly if they had the finances to set up their own printmaking. But that created that I wasn't really ready for that, or certainly not financially. But it was also that printmaking requires a lot of processing, a lot of different materials and chemicals. And when you're doing an image, you're always having to think in reverse, because you work on an image and actually when you print it, it's the mirror image of what you see when you're working. And there's all these levels. And also at that time too, I was very much aware that printmaking was no longer given so much attention. It was, if you at that time, I think there was one gallery near the Art Gallery of Ontario that showed prints, and it actually probably closed down soon after that era as well, because printmaking just wasn't as important. It wasn't given as much attention. And there was a lot of limitations for an artist just in doing a print. The other thing about printmaking is it's editions. Well, unless you've got a market, why would you want to, have to make multiples with something that didn't make sense to me personally as an artist at that time. So there's probably a lot more reasoning behind that, but that's what I can think of right now.
We have a question here in the chat room. It says, being a child of the 60s, were there instances where you may have had altered states which may have influenced some of your imagery?
I'm afraid not. I was really square. No, but I have had people talk to me, say, with looking at my images just recently, when the show went up, that some of my imagery reminded them of kind of had a quality that they have felt on mushrooms, and so maybe that's
yeah, there definitely is references. Like I saw it actually in some of your BFA work, that there was sort of a surrealist quality to that work, and I'm thinking of like the Return series as well. There's definitely nods to surrealism there. So yeah.
Yeah, there is. Surrealism, there's so many different kinds of surrealism. I think that my work has that quality because I am moving into an altered perspective, not an altered perspective, a different perspective. I am looking at, I'm using representation and I'm looking at the real world, but I'm introducing things that I feel exist, or ways that we could look at our reality that we normally don't see or are open to. So I think that's why it moves into that more surrealist, altered kind of reality.
Lisa Streifler has just asked a question. Speaking of altered states, could you speak about becoming a mother, or how becoming a mother affected your work in your art practice?
Thank you for that question, Lisa. I hadn't planned on being a mother, but there I was. It was, to me, another learning experience. But I think then, for the first time, my experience with realizing that my body knows things that my head doesn't know. And so I did a lot of reading. I even went to a midwife conference. Not that I was interested in being a midwife, but I was interested in that community. So I opened myself up to another community. Myself, I got a birthing coach where I was really learning a lot of things. And I guess in my art practice, too, those things started showing up. For example, when I was pregnant, I was, my life around me, my daily life was quite stressful for a whole bunch of reasons. And to keep calm and keep grounded, I would have a warm bath and play a audio tape of various species of frogs singing. So there's a frog in that species. And it was just again that realizing, and going back to that first Coppell and Time print, the uninterrupted processes coming into being and passing away, that I felt very locked into that processes. I am now this vehicle for this uninterrupted process of coming into being and passing away. So I became aware of that, but I also became aware of my body. My body knows things that I consciously don't. So there's that unusual thing of, you know, getting to know your body, getting to understand what your body's telling you, how you feel, what that means, and opening up levels of, I guess, knowing that isn't necessarily up here, that we as a culture, at least back then, there's more awareness now, but as a culture, we don't think that way. We think that it all comes from here, but it was my awareness that there's knowing that comes from our bodies, and then those bodies, I started to realize, extend to other bodies, the earth body and other species. So that's what came together. And I think, I mean, I'm sure that there were other things that had come before my pregnancy that got me on that path, but pregnancy really started making those ideas grow.
There was one thing when you mentioned that that your experience of pregnancy and motherhood, you became you just mentioned that you became more aware of other bodies, other species, and so I guess it was making you also aware of our connections to the natural world. You also made a comment that you became very aware that you wanted to have a sustainable future for your son. And so, you know, being environmentally, your ego consciousness was raised. I mean, it was already there, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, especially in terms of there's a body of work in the exhibition, early series, water saving and life safety, that came out of an experience that you had in terms of environmental activism.
That's right. Yeah, the water saving and life safety series came before I was pregnant. And I was working with Pollution Probe for a while, and they had a big campaign at that time to help clean up and preserve Lake Ontario. So, there was that part of my experiences where I was learning a lot about, pollution and what was going on with our lake. But very soon after, while I was pregnant, we made a move to, what was the name of it? Leslieville, right? And when we moved there, we soon found out that first 12 inches of soil for many blocks, including ours, where I lived, were being removed because it was polluted with lead from a battery plant that was at the end of our street. So yes, I started to become very aware that anything I may have known is not over there, but it's right here. And in fact, they were testing mothers and children, their lead levels, which both Aaron and I were high at one point, higher. Now, I don't remember numbers, but there was an actual concern for that. And that's when I became involved with a group of women who had already been working on advocacy work in the neighborhood that I lived in, and not just the battery plant, but other industries in that neighborhood. Did I answer that?
Yeah, no, great, thank you. So there was the when you were talking about we talked a little bit about the surrealism in the Return series, and that was one of the series. There's a few that you did sort of based on your experience of pregnancy and motherhood, where you said that you sort of became very aware of like sort of grounding within the body, and I was seeing that in that work. You're often questioning not only that work, but many of your bodies of works that you've worked on, that you're questioning established philosophies and thinking about our bodies and nature. And in the Return series, which I will take this to here actually, you've got some references to religion and to science, and so there's I'm just taking us back here. There we go. There we are. And with the image of the burning bush and sort of the references to evolution, just wondered if you wanted to talk about what sort of things you were questioning there.
It's interesting that word questioning, because I'm trying to remember back where I was at that point. I don't know if I was questioning as much as I was seeking or searching for something, some kind of enlightenment or pathway that made sense to me personally. I do recall too that when I'm looking at this work now, I not at this time, but it did bring me to some of writings, awareness of cosmologies and mythologies. There was Marcia Kennedi's book, something of the eternal return, that I read. So I was going back to older mythologies and looking at them and doing some reading that brought them into more of a contemporary perspective. I was personally taking, they gave me a lot of value. I felt that they were more connecting. They seemed to open my perspectives, and I felt excited and good about that journey I was on.
In the next series, that the Wailings of Windswept Soil, which we see here, there's two parts to it, Elegy 1 and Elegy 2. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the motivations behind that work. And I just want to mention too, like, as you're talking about your work, and I think it's quite obvious that your work is, even though you've got ideas and there's concepts and convictions that are driving your work, like concerns that you have about the world, and you're definitely expressing and questioning you know, our relationship to nature and that sort of thing within your work. But every body of work that I've had discussions with you about always comes from a personal, it starts out with a personal experience, which is really great.
Yeah, and I think that's why when you were saying I was questioning, I think that back then I think we all go through life, and it starts from our childhood, where we sometimes think about things and we might say something as a child, but you know, we don't get the right answer. It doesn't feel like the right answer, or you feel, well, that's not fair, or that's not right. We go through life all the time with those things, but a lot of times we don't say anything. We don't pursue those, looking into those things that you really feel comfortable with. Well, in a sense, my art practice was a way of looking into those things that I didn't really feel comfortable with. And what's so wonderful about an art practice is it's a way of finding yourself through a world that if you do have questions or concerns or don't feel that something's quite right, you can use your practice to explore those ideas. And so you're reading, you might be going to lectures, you might be seeing things along with personal experiences. And you know, I'm not an academic in a way that I could bring all those things together and use all of those things to try and understand myself, what gave me meaning, what gave me a feeling of, to feel good about things having meaning to me in a personal way, that I didn't have to grow up and do it maybe the way that I should have maybe questioned when I was younger. Those are kind of things that you keep to yourself. And artists, they explore those ideas in their lifetime and through their practice. It's always looking for, well, that doesn't seem quite right. And then trying to find something that looks better, that feels more correct, that feels more truthful, that gives maybe some hope or comfort. Mm-hmm. I like learning things.
Yeah. The Wailings of Windswept Soil, what's really fascinating about this work is that you've created these grounds that are mixtures of soil and wax, and so there's like this real visceral experience of this work, and yet there's also a beautiful poetry to it and symbolism. Can you talk a little bit, you've mentioned that you were concerned about depletion of soils with this work. Can you talk a little bit about the ideas behind it?
It's a worldwide concern, and you know, living on the prairies, anyone who, you know, knows the history of the prairies in the dirty 30s when we were losing our topsoil, which is blowing away, and that would boil down to how people who came here were using the land. And so yes, the basic fertility of all life is based on the health of our soil and our skies and our water and our air and our water. So that was, so yeah, I was, those would be one of the things. Again, like the series before, where I show in the return series with the birthing and so the body is the earth, and so it was continuation of thinking of earth as body, but also the soil and fertile soil is not dead; it is living, and so again, those were some of the ideas that were urgent and strongly felt that are behind that series.
There's a question here from Timothy Long. He said, how would you describe the connection of your paintings to the viewer in terms of umbilical cord, earth tremor, or radio waves? It seems more poetic and physical than just looking.
I was thinking of our, you know, when I was taking the class on printmaking together, and you were wearing, I have this image of you in a respirator, using some dangerous chemical.
Yes.
in the to do, I think it was photo etching. And
oh, yeah, I bet I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to.
Well, well, that's good, because I don't know what I'm going to say. But it's like, but it just strikes me that there's a sense of in your work that it's almost like I always feel like I'm back behind the mask, because like I need the oxygen source while I'm going into that world that you've created. Because that world is so somewhere else that it's hard to communicate with it directly. You know, I always have and that's what I was thinking. Like, how are your paintings communicating with me? Like I'm thinking of the earth. It's like, are you creating a tremor for me to feel? Are you sending out X-rays so that I can, you know, see the inside of my skull? Are you, you know, am I connected with an umbilical cord, so I don't need to breathe oxygen because it's being fed to me directly into my bloodstream?
So Timothy, do you mean that the work, there's a veil between you and the work that you feel like you're unable to quite connect with? Is that what you mean?
Well, I think it's two things, because I feel like there's always like this piece of glass. Sometimes there's physically a glass. Sometimes it just feels like it's under a bell jar, you know, because, but at the other time, on the other sense, it makes me feel like it's connecting in another kind of way that's much more direct, that's more primordial maybe, or is more, you know, mysterious. So I like that. I just love that kind of double sense to the work. And I just wonder how you feel about how you connect your paintings to the viewer, if that's something you think about.
Yes, I do. And again, you know, we all have our way of working and trying to connect. I do know that, for example, we're looking at these water series right now, they're up. I felt a need that and not just this series, but I feel that they are removed. Often there's a dark background, things seemed isolated, so I pare down things to what I feel are visual essentials, so that the language or symbols can interconnect within the work and to the viewer a little bit more clearly, so that they're not maybe caught up in something that's more easily pictorial but symbolic. And I know that, you know, you mentioned bell jar, there is a kind of sense with that. And I also think, like, even with looking at images surrounded by darkness, in that sense, it's in those particular ones, it's soil, but it's not often soil I'm using. I do feel like I'm entering a kind of a space, and maybe often the kind of space that at night in the darkness, ideas and feelings and maybe eureka moments can occur, or relationships be discovered or thought about or reflected upon from our experiences through the day or through our lives. It's that kind of very privatized, interior, very intimate space that we make those connections, I think. At least for me, in my experience. Does that kind of get to some of the questions you had?
I like that. That sounds good.
Now, I certainly wasn't doing that, Timothy, with these big gold pieces.
Well, they emanate it, but they have an almost sense of that you don't look at them, they emanate towards you.
That's right.
Really.
Yeah. They could be banners carried throughout the street, these big banners.
I was just going to say, speaking of bell jars, the work Nosto Elgos certainly has that sort of feeling. Can you talk a little bit about that work and what inspired that series?
Okay. Well, I did it as, well, again, when I'm working, I don't often know what I'm going to do next or where it's leading, but I had been working on the Phantom Limb series, and that's when this piece kind of came together at that same time. And it is hard to kind of remember back all of the little things that brought that piece together, but I do specifically know that when my son, he was about 2 years old, and every day we went to the car in the parking lot of the apartment we lived in. We had to come by this dead bird that was laying in the parking lot, and it's very close to our car, so we couldn't avoid it. And so many children, many people, their first experience of death are as a child, often a pet. In this case, it was a dead bird that died by our car in the parking lot. And my son looked down at the bird, and he was very concerned. He says, I might not get the exact words, it's written down somewhere. Oh, the poor little birdie, now he can't fly home. Of course, a child who sees something that might discomfort him, his first feeling is, I want to be home, I want to be safe. And then I guess that moved into other thoughts about the bird, again, what was I reading then? I'd probably know if I'd read my notes. Well, yeah, I do remember reading at that time some work on Jacob Bohm, who is a Renaissance visionary, and writings referring to his work, and Bazarab Nicolaides. No, is that it? I'm not getting it.
Nicolescu?
Yes, yes. Who is quantum physics is his area of study. And so it's looking at levels of reality, and I won't go, unless it comes up later, I won't go into detail, but it was looking at levels of reality and different states of being. And so I had, let's see, yes, trying to remember more details where that came from, but it basically there's the 7 levels of reality from the Jacob Bohm in the Phantom Limb series, and so I echoed those 7 levels in the 7 glass birdhouses, which in a sense we're giving them a home, but there's a lot of contradictions in that work too, because it's the glass in our homes that have killed a lot of birds. So there's all of these sort of things that you can enter the work in. But for me, it was just thinking about that first kind of expression of concern of my son, me thinking about that, and doing some of this reading that work came about. And so the bird in the birdhouses, the bird is totally taken apart. There's no whole bird in that series. There's I physically took the body of the dead bird apart, cleaned its bones, and laid it out in all 7 glass birdhouses, which have an altar-like feeling. They could feel maybe funerary or like a place of rest in a way of heightening it as something that's sacred.
We have a question here from Holly Faye. It says, hi Marcia, can you speak more about the dichotomy of death and birth, hope and despair in your work?
That's pretty general. Birth and death?
Death and birth. Death and birth, hope and despair. Yeah.
Yeah, the cycle of life is definitely through a lot of my work.
Sorry.
Pardon?
Sorry, I was just gonna, I'll let you go.
Okay.
Let you go. Yeah.
I'm not too sure if Holly could be more specific. I am, a lot of my work, and more so maybe the earlier work, I am looking at life cycles, the cycle of life. And in that, I also was looking at a lot of mythologies. And, you know, I've looked at a lot of religious and spiritual traditions and beliefs, none of which I've embraced really specifically, but they've all informed me. You know, a lot of times people are disturbed by the fact that there's death in my work, or there's that darkness in my work. But I guess I don't see that as a person. I mean, of course, death is not a good thing, but I think it's a way of embracing life and accepting those cycles that is more my focus, because in our culture we're so afraid of death, and that's caused us a lot of problems as well, which could be, you know, many more discussions, but I don't know if that answers Holly's kind of
yeah, I think so, Marcia. You know, I was thinking about the birds in your paintings, the often dead birds.
Yes.
And of course they represent death, but I think they represent many more things. So could you talk about that a little bit, like how you're using that kind of, I mean, because the bird is you know, it's a symbol of hope, really. It's like this winged creature that, you know, is in the heavens, and they're often dead and lying on grounded in your work. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's more specific. Yes.
Thanks, Marcia. I'm a better talker than typer.
So that series too came about, that whole series really came about too, you know, having a young child, and you spend a lot of time walking in back alleys and in any areas where you can get a bit of nature space for your child. And you're always running into bits of nature. And so there's 2 things that came out of that, that came into that series, that came from those experiences walking with my son. And that was, what are all of these weeds that seem to come up, bursting themselves, cracking open the asphalt and bursting forth? I mean, I knew there were things that we don't want. You know, they're weeds. They're, you know, there's nothing valuable about them. And then also coming across dead birds. parts of dead birds or other animals that have passed, and you come upon those. So, but I started to be really curious about why we hate these weeds and the great effort we go to get rid of them. And so the birds in that series are all birds that have come to me through people that I was knew I was painting the birds, and I was interested in painting the birds to know the birds, the actual species. I wasn't painting the bird for some emotive expressive reason. They became studies of the actual dead bird. But these birds that I was painting are all birds that came to me or were personally found because they had hit someone's windows, they'd been hit by a car. A couple of them had been electrocuted well, they might not be in these paintings, but so they were all kind of deaths that occurred because these birds had come across something in their environment that was human caused. And I didn't use a lot of birds that were killed by cats, domestic cats, because they can rip them up pretty much. So that's another question. Well, why are they so perfect looking if they're dead? I'm not showing, that breakdown of the flesh or any violence on the body. And that was again to create a kind of peacefulness, a reflection that I didn't want to focus on the pain or the flesh decaying. It was I wanted to take you somewhere else. So with these images of the birds, and again, there's different pieces in this whole series, but often they were diptychs or triptychs that included etchings of weeds in them. And all the weeds I used were on the noxious weeds list in Saskatchewan. And it is an actual list. We live in an agricultural place where there's actual laws that if you have on your land too many of those weeds, you'll get fined, or if you don't clean them up, and then they'll come and clean them up themselves, and they'll fine you. But these are all chemicals that are causing all sorts of problems, and we know DDT that we use as a pesticide was really killing a lot of our birds, and there's still issues with that. So again, it was pointing to our relationship with the land, with the species, and these weeds, these plants, pointing to and nudging us towards thinking about what they mean to us or what they could mean to us and our relationship with them. And of course, a lot of the images, the images in much of these series are references to the table. Because that's where, we come together, all creatures come together in a similar way, and that we all eat. That's our creaturely needs that we share with all living beings. And so there's that kind of, okay, there's the dead bird, there's a noxious weed, there's the pesticides, which go through all of the food sources, and breaking down the barriers between us and them, including the bad plants that we don't want. So there was that kind of happening in the work as well. I think there's other ideas going on in there, but
I like how the domesticated table also connects to the idea of domesticating the land.
yes,
and making it serve our purposes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. In the whole series, I actually have etched into the glass actual names of places where you can find certain types of invasive species. And these noxious weeds didn't come, the ones that I'm using in this series are not native here. They, in many various ways, have been introduced either knowingly or unknowingly to this environment. And most of them are Eurasian, where they've come from, but various places in the world. And so in some of the pieces, can I see any of these? I don't remember which ones are actually in in the show, but there's waste places, abandoned places, cultivated fields. I think there's 5 that I had, which again in themselves are poetic. I use them in a poetic way, but they're actual, you know, words that they use for where these noxious weeds are mostly found. Yeah.
There's a question here from Lisa Streifler. She says, I know you have extensive knowledge of birds and bird migratory patterns. I'm curious about the specific birds you depict in your work. Could you speak about why you choose certain birds for your pieces? Are the birds symbolic?
Birds that I chose were ones that I happened to have a specimen for. So they were birds that had fallen, either, you know, hitting someone's window, being hit by a car. I was saying earlier, various ways that these birds have died. So I guess at that time I painted what came to me. Does that make sense? So I wasn't choosing. I didn't like, this is a junco, and I didn't say, oh, I want to paint a junco, because that means something. In fact, what was really great about this series is, and I don't know an awful lot about birds. I mean, I do compared to the average person. And I know a lot more than the average person, but I know also very little. And the other thing about my work and this particular series is I got to know what birds were here. Unfortunately, I found them, you know, when someone bring me in a brown or plastic bag, you know, a specimen that was killed by a window or something. And so I got to know that bird, and because in painting the bird, it was a study of the bird itself, what the bird looked like. And I'm thinking, you know, I'm displaying the actual, that bird that is sitting right in front of me. And so I didn't extend into the actual works themselves how each specific bird was killed. I guess that's more when you're looking at the series, you're more looking at the way we treat our land and how we use pesticides in our land. So that's more of a focus in this series, even those other issues are there.
So Marcia, you referenced Saskatchewan in this work by referencing the Noxious Weed Act, and you've referenced it in other works like Hopal and Time, and then in other like later series like Mapping the Land and Body. Just wondering if you could talk about why you want to focus on Saskatchewan. I guess besides the obvious reasons, but.
Well, I think that, well, it is obvious, is because I'm here, but the problems and concerns that I have here are everywhere in the world. But I do think, and again, you know, I won't go into a long kind of story about it, but at one point in my interest politically and in international issues, I started to feel, you know, I really need to be paying attention to what's going on in my own backyard, so to speak. And I think that is a really good place to start, where you are, being aware of where you are, how you live here, what are the natural systems and systems and habitats, and what's going on where you live. And we don't have a really good awareness of that, particularly if you live in the city, and perhaps not either if you even live rurally. If your only interest in the land is for the value of the land based on money and accommodating human interests. So, did I answer that?
I was wondering if you could speak to the Mapping in the Land and Body series. That's where we're sort of at in the PowerPoint now, and wondered if you could talk about how you approach this, like how you're using diagrams and maps and text and embedding it into the figures in this work, and having each figure is cradling or holding a species. Can you talk about the ideas behind that work?
Okay, let's see, this series of work began after I finished the Still Life series. And I learned a lot in doing about, my own environment, about, a lot of things about Saskatchewan, living here, and the bird species through that series. But I myself, when I went through the show, it created a very quiet place. And there was a tone to it that I understood the complexity of people's feelings when they saw it, because it's kind of funerary. There's a sense of death. So with these, I was still dealing, the ideas and everything were still really there, but I decided, no, I'm going to open it up like this and shift the tone to something that's a bit different. And so instead of the dark, I went gold leaf, and I went life size, and I used the figures as a place to build on the stories that you kind of evolved from the Still Lives series.
The use of gold leaf, it certainly adds to the reading of these pieces as being religious icons, but also the way that you've painted the figures, where it's they've got this like golden bodies, patterned bodies, the green hair, they seem like religious icons. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. For one, I will maybe just, if I get on a tangent, stop me. But I just wanted to say first, this also started from this series, kind of burst through when a friend of mine became diagnosed with breast cancer. And, she was someone that really took care of herself compared to me. And, it just seemed like a mystery, and it was a very traumatic time for her and for myself and her family and close friends. She's okay now, many, many years later. But there was that, thought of, well, she grew up in a small town. At the very end of her backyard was a farmer's field. Now, again, I don't know, that may not have had anything to do with it, because, I don't even know what kind of chemicals they may or may not have been using back then, because it's changed so much in my lifetime. But it was back to the land, the body, and our relationship there. And that sort of stirred that series. And so that was the first one I did, but then again, it started to grow into other areas, and thinking, even back in the series Still Lives, I was so often, when I was working on that series, I was thinking of, the settlers, European settlers, when they first came here. I had these little scenarios going on in my head about, oh my God, they're not, winter's never going to end. And I was thinking how incredibly powerful it must have been when that first bird arrived and started singing. And I think that, many of us still feel that even now after our long winters. So, but it was at that point where my mind kept going back, that those early days, and when colonialism and when settlers came here, how much they really changed the land. So that story is continued and examined more in this series. So with the bodies, they become vessels of a story. They all on their bodies are maps of Saskatchewan that show the different treaties in Saskatchewan, that shows you on this one, this is where the rebellion took place. This one shows well, it's already passed, but it shows different aspects. Yeah, this one shows, where is it? It's a radar base that is there that was probably first put up there when we were afraid of the Russians putting missiles through that direction. So I was thinking, not even the sky is as free of our control. And so I'm looking at all levels of what European values and beliefs and lifestyles and hopes and dreams brought to the prairie. And that's, so it's the story. And these are actually the chemical symbols of chemicals used in the environment. And they include lots of different chemicals, not just for crops, but what they put into rivers and streams to control this or that. She's holding a meadowlark. And a lot of these chemicals that come from actual stories where there was a field, and I'm not too sure, I don't remember the chemical, and it was in the States, where there was a field of dead meadowlarks because they landed just after the field was treated. And so all these little things always, you know, get thrown into the pot, and they become part of the story that you know, even though there's an overall story to the work, each piece often has its own individual story as well. And you know, over time I'll probably forget most of them, but but they were at that kind of intensity when they were made. I think the railway is on the burrowing owl, and this particular piece has the stories written onto it. You can't see, there's writing, and then I've made the stripes. I went to the, I used the archives at the University of Regina a lot, and I started reading journals from the very first explorers that came here. And so some of their words are written on some of the bodies too. And then the bodies are all holding indigenous remnants of either, you know, bones or whatever, or a specimen that I got from the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, and they're all indigenous animals of Saskatchewan. Some of them exportated and some of them extinct. I think there's a, yeah, yeah, I think this series included, it did, one of the passenger pigeons, which of course is extinct. So it's that kind of bringing together of human activity, how we've changed the land, how we've changed, you know, with what happened to the people that were here, and they're shown on, you know, small area, designated areas, and again, it's about exploring the differences of values and beliefs, and the damage that Western culture or settler culture has had on the land and the people that were here, because we thought we had a better plan. We thought we could, you know, do something with this. Let's dig it all up and do what we want with it. In fact, you know, when my mother was in her late 80s, we would drive out to the Echo Valley every once in a while. Because my grandfather had a cottage there, and we used to spend time out there. And on the trip back one time, she was looking out in the passenger seat, and she says, she's shaking her head, and she says, "What a waste." And I thought, what's she talking about? I said, "What do you mean, Mom?" She meant, you know, on that drive, and they're disappearing too, you'll see groves of trees, clumps of trees, that hadn't been bulldozed down, that are being left, fortunately, but unfortunately, they're getting rid of those too. What she meant is, what a waste that they kept those trees there. They should get rid of those, because, you know, then you could farm more land and get more out of the land. So but my mother, you know, she was born in 1921. So we all have different perspectives, but when you're brought up in a culture where it's normalized, you can absorb that and believe that, or you can question it and start learning. And a lot of people are doing that now. And we need to be doing that. We need to be learning and being more conscious of everything we do. because we are very anthropocentric, a species that's anthropocentric, and we've created a world that satisfies us. The world we have created has taken up our intellect, our imagination, and the physical world.
I was wondering, Marcia, the next body of work, you had a big shift in scale when you created this series called Face in the Clouds. And so this was a series of miniature paintings that you presented as an installation at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in 2005. There was 30 in the original series, and we've got 19 in the exhibition here. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the shift, not only in scale, but in focus as well, because you sort of shifted to a global, a focus on the global scale. You began to source images from the internet using sort of mass media images and combining them with details from art historical paintings. So you created this beautiful montage of images that have sort of this intense beauty and sort of religious inspiration, as well as tragedies. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what inspired that series.
Yeah, I'm trying. Again, I don't remember the original kind of thoughts. First of all, there was a lot going on in the world at that time, so I was pulling in what was happening to me at the time. That image that we just saw, that was the 9/11, and one of the towers is just starting to sink in like this. And then there was this, that huge disaster with the tsunami. There were, this is Abu Ghraib, that image that we all saw in the news. This prisoner is holding his hands out like this, and they have wires connected to his fingers. They're not really electrocuting him, but they were teasing that he would. So it was about all of these things going on in the world. And I've spliced in with those images art historical images that are religious. I've also put in art historical images from bits and pieces. You know, they're all bits and pieces, not the whole painting. Art historical images from a landscape just showing the sky, or an art historical seascape just showing a bit of the sea. And all of the images I'm using are not fixed solid objects. Like there's drapery that moves and shifts, there's sky and clouds that move and shift, water moves and shifts, smoke moves and shifts. And so it was that kind of, the other thing too that happened around that time, you know, you always see in the news, a woman sees, you know, the image of Christ in her toast. And this is not an uncommon thing in these sightings. And for some reason that kind of, I started to think, well, we often maybe see things that aren't there. Of course, there is that kind of a natural way our brain works, that we see faces and, you know, recognize faces from very early when we were born. But it's the context and what we think we see, I think, is often based on the world we live in, that we have created and thus believe in. So we have, so I'm using images that I think too are kind of burned into the mind of mostly someone like myself. I've had art history. I come from a family it's more or less Christian, well, that is Christian. And, you know, I've been educated in a very, you know, typical Western education. And so what I see in the world, I'm going to see through that lens. So I started looking at how it's, you know, questioning that lens, because a lot of the images I'm presenting here are things that are happening in the news around me. But I'm also showing things that, and pointing to things that are, you know, like the Challenger explosion is there. And I put that one in because that's an image that is burnt into my head, like a lot of those kinds of moments of tragedy, or the opposite of tragedy, something that's exhilarating or big in your life in some sort of way. That's the Challenger, one of the Challenger ones. So I started putting these together and kind of picking away at, you know, the notion that the things that are really important to us that we've embraced in our Western cultures, technology, our hopes, our dreams, and I'm also pointing to, you know, world religions that are, you know, really important religions, and not necessarily even Western religions either. So I'm pointing to and thinking about humanity and our hopes and dreams, and it's sort of split through and pointing to our failures and some of the tragedies that have come from that too. So I'm kind of shaking it up a bit.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And another series that you were accessing images from the internet and looking at when you were doing some research on sort of global environmental and political concerns and animal rights was Upon My Lap, The World is at Play. And you deal with some pretty disturbing images that you found online, but you also sort of created a compilation of those images along with domestic images. Here we are here. And can you talk a little bit about how, and you know, even to the title, Upon My Lap, The World is at Play, you're referencing accessing the world of these images from your laptop.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, well, I just want to say, you mentioned the religious thing in Facing the Clouds, and this, I am like this in this one even more so. Like I'm thinking of the Book of Hours and illuminated manuscripts, all of which show day-to-day kind of things, but also usually there's a story or a moral kind of lesson in those historical documents, visual documents. And I've kind of, you know, that's kind of I referenced that in my work as well. So with this, yes, it took me a while, but I finally got my own laptop, and I realized, oh, wow, I don't have to wait, you know, to get the newspaper, or, you know, wait for this magazine to come in my mail. All of this information I have access to. And so, of course, I had that up to some extent at work, but there was a computer, but again, it wasn't part of my life at that point to be doing a lot of research on the internet and exploring things. So there were things I was definitely interested in, and of course I was already doing a bit of that when this started, but I started looking into other things that I realized, well, I could look into what's going on with animal rights issues or animal abuse here or there. And there's lots of organizations, and everyone knows that now, it's very common. But back then, that you can belong to this, you get information, there's this community out there, which is also very confusing. But for me, it was kind of a very strange feeling when I first started exploring the internet in the privacy of my home, in the comfort of my love seat, or even in my bed with a cup of coffee beside me. I could explore this world in complete safety, and it's a world that you can feel detached from, but there's all this stuff happening that is very difficult. It's very difficult. You know, when I began this series, I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I began this series because I wanted to try and find something out. I wanted to know what I could learn from this. It was a very depressing experience. I also had some personal things going on in my life that didn't help. I went to some places on the internet that I would never go to again. But I guess what I could say, what I did learn from that, and that what many of us know now and have for quite a while, is that we're not disconnected from these things. We feel safe. There is that, you know, there is that distance possibly. But in some of these, I'm showing, like, this is an image of me, and this is from a diamond mine north in Saskatchewan. So I'm looking at environmental issues, issues of war, and also, and these are images, you know, again, it was a media images, and I'm in each one, I'm putting something from my own personal life in it. Like, this is an actual rubber duck, you know, and whether I used my son, myself, my dog, my cat, and toys and things around the house, because for each one, I was putting myself, or thinking about that mingling of self, or representations of self within that bigger picture. And of course, then if you start thinking about a lot of these issues, we're not separate from them at all. And there's many things that we do that we don't even understand that are actually causing a lot of pain and damage somewhere else, because we all truly are connected. And in any case, as soon as you know something not good, you're totally affected, because you have seen or witnessed or know about that, and you can't and then you can no longer forget that or ignore that. So I don't know if I answered that, did I?
Oh, yeah, no, that was great. Thank you, Marcia. Another series that you made during the mid to late 2000s was the Rapture Flora, and so that's the series of encaustic paintings. They're very just exquisite, and here I believe you're referencing images of plant sex organs, and so this sort of connects back to the Elegy 2 and Phantom Limbs, where you're making connections between human biology and plant biology. Just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about what inspired this series.
Well, the study that I had already begun looking at that, but really what launched this is, again, you know, as I mentioned before, I do a lot of reading and looking at things and exploring things that kind of gets into that big pot, and I use that as a resource. But, you know, this particular piece, I was wandering around in the, you know, plant morphology area of the University of Regina. I came across a really old text, and it, you know, it had these really tiny little drawings of, you know, these things. And the one that really caught me right away was, it showed up at one point here. It's shaped like a heart, and so that visually caught my eye. And then I started reading about these and what they were, and it just began this series. And of course, I used for titles from the poem Metamorphosis of a Plant, I think it's called, yeah, Metamorphosis of a Plant by Garrett, as the titles of these. So it's again, once again, kind of, you know, looking, we wouldn't even know these things existed for one thing, but weren't for technology, because you need, you know, no, what do you call those things? Not a magnifying glass.
Microscope.
Microscope, thank you. Yeah. And, you know, there's, I mean, back when I got, you know, that text that had those little drawings, that they're much more magnificent now. And in fact, they could photograph these things now. So anyways, you're looking into a world that normally wouldn't be even available to us without technology. But it also seemed like this kind of a fascinating secret world, these layers of reality that get smaller and smaller, or if you're going this way, bigger and bigger. I mean, all these levels of bodies and exist places, real places. So I looked into that world, and where am I going with this? I related it back to self, our own bodies, and some of these, the stoma of a plant are these little, tiny little microscopic openings on leaves, for example, and they look very much like the female vulva up close, or vagina. And but these are all, mostly, not all, but mostly focused on the reproductive organs or processes within plants. And a lot of the plants I've used are more primitive plants because they were visually more interesting. But it's bringing together human sentiment, experience, bodies with these other worlds that exist around us. And I also really kind of felt this feeling that I'm peering into, the original kind of beginnings of desire in terms of the reproduction of plants and life.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had, especially now during the time of COVID-19, we've had some people say that, just the sort of the molecular level of these kind of, they makes them even think of virus as well.
That's right.
And then your work in about 2007, you started, the birds came back to your canvases and your panels. You had series Birds, Nests, Water, Sky, and then this series here, the portraits from 2015. Why did you want to talk a little bit about why birds came back into your subject matter? Or they were always there?
I remember once when Still Life series, or part of it, showed somewhere in Prince Albert, someone in the audience, or one of the viewers, there was an artist talk, and put up his hand and he says, "Are you going to be the lady that does paintings of birds all your life?" And I thought that was a really weird question. But yeah, I guess so. I guess he was right, but not totally right. I think birds are first of all, I've always liked birds. They've been in my life for a long time, domestic birds, and then rescuing birds. And maybe, I guess around that time I started painting the game again, is I was living, I shared my living room with two rescued flightless crows. They couldn't fly, so they couldn't be released. And maybe that's why they came in. But yeah, definitely birds have been in my work, because as a symbol relating to the concerns for the environment, you've got Rachel, what's her name?
Carson?
Rachel, huh?
Rachel Carson.
Thank you. You've got her, and she made those relationships in her writing, but there's just so much writing, poetry, science, studies, etc., that it's a natural kind of thing. It's also something that we get to see more of, even though for many people they don't see the birds. Once you start to look, they are there. They still remain somewhat of a mystery unless you do some work, but they are visible. And we do live on a migratory path. There's a ton of birds that come through here. So there's that part that they're in my life, were in my life since childhood. I could say more about that because in that last series that's in the show, I did start to explore why birds, Marcia? Like, why are you doing birds? Because I knew they meant more than, you know, how I was using them in my work. There was something deeper than that. And I was trying to figure it out. Well, why am I, you know, why do I have this real deep affinity for birds? And so that started that last series that's in the show. It doesn't, the works don't really talk about that, but it took me, that question took me to looking at way back into my childhood. And that's the work in that last body of work in the show. Looks back, not present.
Yeah, the Afterlife series.
Yeah, yeah. The only thing that's present or current in those, because I'm using antique and vintage photos, is the actual body of the dead bird. So yeah, that represents present, and the rest represents a past in my lifetime where, you know, people could be my family, could be, you know, people, you know, just settler culture and beliefs, things that we brought with us, beliefs and values and dreams that actually we didn't know or weren't conscious of how destructive those hopes and dreams, what kind of destruction were held in those hopes and dreams for the environment. And of course, the birds are all represent the environment. Of course, we're losing all our birds too. We've lost many of our birds. Just, well, I can't remember the numbers, but there was in the past year, they posted how many birds we've lost since the 1970s.
The Afterlight series, it's interesting how you're taking a look back, and like you said, like you're referencing settler history, really, and which is your own family history and many of our families' histories as immigrants, and wanting having this idea of yeah, pursuing a dream and progress. Can you talk a little bit about the House Home Habitat series, which it's a brand new series. You haven't exhibited the works before, and they're very connected to Afterlight, but they do include a crane, but there's other species as well, and a hawk.
Yeah,
and they're set within a Victorian domestic setting.
Yeah, they do diverge. And one thing that I never talked about, but all of the birds up until, or all the species I've used, and certainly all the birds that I've painted are all life-size. You know, I paint them as closely as I can to what they actually look. And in every painting you see, you're not just looking at the bird, you're looking at the bird, the actual size the specimen would be. And I don't know what it is about that. It's just that all of these, they're all, you know, if you have that painting and you look at the size of the bird, that's the size of the bird that exists as a specimen or as a species. So that was really important to me for a whole bunch of reasons that maybe aren't important, I don't know, but that's the way it felt important to me. But, and so you will see in a lot of these works that the bird is too large for the environment sitting in. These, which are the series you're just talking about, I'm using larger specimens. There's no way that I can use them life size. So I've just changed the way I'm using the specimen. I'm not using a photograph of the specimen. I'm just taking an image and painting it into an interior or place that is from a vintage or antique photograph. And one thing that maybe we didn't talk about very much, but I use the actual antique photo, and I have Gary Robbins scan them for me and then print them to this largest size he can in most cases for the printer that he has. And then I do a whole bunch of things to seal it off. And then, oh, wait a minute, I missed a step in there. Then I take the photo, the antique photo that's enlarged, and I use that as a backdrop for, that's a real bird in there set with an antique photo on the back here. Now this isn't an antique photo, it's one I sometimes use antique or vintage dolls or doll furniture or something too. So I'm playing with different levels of creating an image. I'm getting to the images that come up.
Oh, you're creating little dioramas in some respects. Yeah, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and I just felt, well, you know, to me it was really important to take that original image that was taken at a specific moment in real time, through the process of how work and light and shadow work, and in this case with, you know, with silver prints or light photography as opposed to digital photography now. But there was that kind of grasping onto that moment, that real moment in history and in time, and introducing something from here right now, and pushing those two times together and I forced them together to say something else, bring meaning. Like, this is an antique photo, and I brought these bird specimens into it. She's just floating down the river. The title of this was Gently Down the Stream. I'm not showing her, you know, coal mining or anything. I mean, she's just going about her business and enjoying her life. But I'm using these kind of banal, kind of innocent moments to show that our presence, our lifestyle, our beliefs, our dreams, our hopes, we're all, you know, constructed in a way that we unknowingly start to unravel what we depend on, and that's a healthy environment, ecosystems, and a world that is more healthy. So I'm not pointing to her particularly. I'm using, these are all images of people that are to me anonymous. So you know, if you go to an antique store, you can get old photographs and stuff, which is kind of funny in itself. I was attracted to images though that seemed to feel more familiar to me from, you know, my past, my family heritage, or images I've seen in antique old photos from my own family. It wasn't important to me to talk about my particular family because, in a sense, some of those photos, I don't know who they are anyways. You know, and most people alive right now don't either. So that didn't matter. It was the general kind of familiarity of my ancestors that I chose these images. I'm using all women in my images. Why? Well, I guess because it's a reflection of myself. It started as my journey to why are birds so important to me, but for some reason, I seem to have that attached to my grandmother, whom I lost around age 9. And there's a whole bunch of other stories and memories that's connected there that come from, you know, that relate to that as well, that aren't really necessarily important to talk about right now.
This series here, the Afterlight series, which are paper works, these are a new series for you as well. And it's wonderful to end the exhibition with these works, and actually, well, they kind of end and start because they're right in the front when you first come in. And so we actually have these works positioned sort of in dialogue with Marcia's first print. So it's kind of nice that the show starts and ends with prints, and it kind of speaks to, you know, the work kind of comes full circle, and it speaks to how the foundations of your work, what initially has inspired you and continues to drive your work, has stayed really steadfast, and has been so unifying through all these different bodies of work. What I found really interesting too is you're using in your subject matter here, you've got some dollhouse furniture and dolls as well, and you started out with that in your BFA prints, which I should have included some images of those, but we do have that one of the text panels, and I just want to mention that we actually have the text panels up on our website if anybody's interested in reading them. I also want to mention that for those of you that aren't going to be able to come and see Marcia's exhibition physically, we are going to have a virtual exhibition, and so that should be probably up on the website by next week sometime, but we'll send out a notification on social media that that it's there and people can go through the exhibition. I'm just going to open up if there's any other questions from the participants. We did actually reach out to people online and ask them if they wanted to send in any comments or questions. And so we have a question here. How often and how long does Marcia spend painting in an average week?
Right now, this week, not very much, none. When I'm working, you know, that really depends on the series. But if you want to, you know, I could say for the oil paintings for the Afterlight series, I'd be working, you know, long hours, which for an old body became an issue. I'd work maybe 8 hours a day, sometimes longer. Sometimes I'd be working on the weekends as well. Because they're intense in that they take a lot of layers of paint. I paint thinly, I use glazes a lot. So they do take a lot of time. My body is having a hard time with that now. I've got a lot of back issues. Even that work that was engraving, I would engrave on glass using flexible shaft Dremel. I'd have to work under a puddle of water. So the way I had to position my body with that too, that's why it's not the only reason, but that was one of the reasons why I didn't continue to work that anymore. And I was younger back then. So.
Another question from social media was, what is your favorite body of work and why?
I don't have a favorite. I like them all for different reasons because I learned something from all of them. You know, and some I might personally love one particular piece more than another, but no, I don't have I can't say I do. It was really nice having the show and Jen walking in there to see for the first time, seeing old friends. Because a lot of this work I hadn't seen for a long time. And I really love seeing the Phantom Limb series again. You know, because I only had really bad slides. And I mean, no, the slides weren't bad, but you put that onto digital to see them and they're not so good. And I realized, oh, I really, really like that series. So yeah, I think, That's my answer. I can't, no favorite there. Different ones for different reasons.
Jordan Wilton's asking, did being a teacher affect your work in any way?
Oh, yeah. Somehow or other when you're working with people and you're trying to stimulate ideas, sometimes there's this circle of things that I'm thinking about, or, you know, that then I get my students thinking about and exploring similar ideas, and I think of things, that there's this kind of, I get this, there's so many, you know, things that I'd like to explore with materials and stuff that I don't have time to. So I get to, you know, create projects where, whether it be projects that are predominantly conceptual or just playing with different materials, my curiosity really explodes into the classroom. And there's a lot of stimulation that I get from that as well. So.
Thanks. Antoinette has asked, do you think that the work you're doing now refers back to your printmaking background?
Yeah, I've been aware for many phases of my art practice that there is a reference back to printmaking, even from the perspective of, well, certainly what I'm doing now, which you see that image here, but even some of the materials I've explored and stuff. I think it was my working in printmaking, which is very technical, and you're dealing with so many technical things and equipment and chemicals and this and that. It's almost like alchemy in itself. I think that gave me, because I mastered that, it gave me the confidence and the mental sort of perspective on materials. I think that formed, you know, my practice to a great deal as well.
Marcia, I just wondered, since your work, it really is contributed a strong and unique voice within Saskatchewan and Canadian contemporary art, especially in terms of feminist and environmental art. Are there artists that you've looked to or that you associate your work with?
In Saskatchewan?
Yeah, in Saskatchewan or just even within Canada?
Well, yeah, that's I would have had you should have asked me that earlier. I could have thought about it more.
Oh.
I know that lots of things have influenced me, but I mean, maybe not in a major way in terms of my particular path. I mean, when I started out with, you know, my interest in the environment and some of the imagery, I was kind of a little bit on the edge. It wasn't, you know, even with, you know, the imagery with mothering, that work was oddly felt as being kind of odd, even in the feminist community. And I won't get into that, but I was accused of making pro-life work, which then becomes, you know, from a political sense, and that's threatening to the freedoms of women, and which is complicated. So I forget what your question was.
If you associate your work
with, right.
Other...
So yeah, not little bits. Not directly. I'm always learning from other people. Sometimes it may be, you know, I'm learning something that about paint or likes the way someone's painting, and it might really, you know, be powerful and be amazing to me, but I will never paint that way, so it doesn't influence me in that way. I'd have to spend more time thinking on that, because I was always stumped too. Jack Anderson, by the way, who is the essayist for the catalog, had asked me that question, and I did come up with some names. I mean, I know that Kiki Smith was someone, and there was many reasons why, because she was also interested in environmental issues. And also what I really liked about her work is because she didn't stay with the same methods, or, I mean, maybe over time, yeah, she did, but she was exploring different ways of different materials and different ways of presenting her subjects or interests. And I liked that, because in my practice, I've never stayed within one, you know, kind of category. I've moved around. My content and my concerns are what ties the work together.
And yes, I should mention the show is touring. Actually, it's going to Swift Current, it's going to Medicine Hat and Vernon, BC. And yes, there will be a publication. It'll be released either late this year or early next year, before the show comes down. Yeah, I guess we'll wrap up. Thank you to Marcia for this. It was a great discussion. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And thanks for everyone who logged on and participated. It was great to have you all be a part of the conversation. And yes, please stay tuned and to see the work either in person or online. So thanks everyone.